The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
I'd like to thank Mr. Rosenfeld for coming during our renovation, because whenever we have a guest speaker, the people back there have to stop jackhammering. So thank you for giving us a little break. Mr. Rosenfeld's new book, his last book was about growing up in Germany and working for the Washington Post in the Watergate days. This book is about his Albany days, a battling editor. He's been all over the Capital District talking about his book, but he worked next door, so it's kind of like coming home. So here's Harry Rosenfeld to talk about battling editor.
Thank you very much for coming out on a very bitter day like this. Well, we have some serious things to talk about, don't we? On this very cold day, because we live in a nation that is troubled and frustrated. More than half our people feel lost, and we argue how we got where we are. A smaller portion is gratified by the very things that anger the majority the most. We are a nation unequally divided, as we have not been since the time before our Civil War. The awesome question for us is, 180 years later, can we avoid descent into another irrepressible conflict? To keep our nation safe and flourishing, the Constitution established a government of balanced power centers to forestall authoritarian rule. The three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, were intended to keep each other in line. The point was to make certain a king never again reigned in America. Today, hyper-partisan politics undermine that safety net. There is only shaky confidence about the nation regaining civic equilibrium and a stable and responsive government. The one flickering light at the end of the dark tunnel is the chance to do so, provided by the election of a Democratic House of Representatives. This can and should constitute a counterweight to a runaway executive bolstered by a supine Senate. By itself, divided government is not an instant solution, only the pathway to one, depending on how prudentially the new House does its work. Even in better times, but especially in our own, when the government structure falters, it is the press, more accurately described today as the media, print, electronic, and digital, that remains to speak truth to power. Because it was doing its constitutionally sanctioned duty, it was demonized from the beginning by Donald Trump in his bid for power. This is a presidency based on the inculcation of fear, as Trump made clear to Bob Woodward and a colleague during the campaign when he boldly told them, real power is fear. When he got that power, he enormously amplified the assault, denouncing the free press as the enemy of the people. It is an epithet with long provenance, originating in imperial Rome, but finding its fearful force deployed in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany to terrorize perceived enemies and silence dissent. His frequent use of the rhetorical accusation reflects President Trump's infatuation with authoritarianism. My memoir, Battling Editor, appears at a time the nation is caught in a vortex of dangers. Now, more than ever, a free press needs to be vigorous. The book takes you inside the belly of the alleged beast to illuminate how quality journalism is constructed. It does so by describing how I executed the mission for which I was hired by publisher Roger Greer to take charge of 2 underperforming regional newspapers and lead them into the first rank. And this had to be done in the face of pressures, traditional and new. Unknown or not understood by me at the time, it also needed to be accomplished in a hurry. The reason was the digital age that in its first stages benefited traditional newspapers because it cut production costs before becoming a strong competitor, luring away readers and advertisers. Today's pencil press faces a daunting future that can only be met by managements skilled in the arts of adaptation. I came to my job as editor of the Morning Times Union and the afternoon Knickerbocker News after long stints in key positions at 2 of America's iconic newspapers. Between my 18th and my 36th birthdays, I worked at the New York Herald Tribune, where I began as a clerk and climbed the greasy ladder rung by rung to become foreign editor. When the Trib folded, I was hired by the Washington Post as Ben Bradley launched his transformation of that paper from humdrum to first class. There I held many command positions, including Metro editor in charge of the daily coverage of the Watergate scandal that toppled Richard Nixon from the presidency. The point of my abandoning all that to take a job in Albany was to become the person in charge and leaving behind the department head positions I had had before. I wanted to implement the knowledge and skills with which my jobs in New York and Washington had equipped me that would earn the Albany papers the distinction Roger Greer had in mind. There was no good reason why hard-hitting and enterprise reporting that distinguished large city newspapers would not just as well serve readers living in smaller cities. It was hard work, accomplished by setting goals and standards, demanding performance, treating people fairly, and hiring carefully. Before I was done, the Times Union, by then having incorporated the Knickerbocker News, had the highest circulation in its history, produced by the largest news staff in its history. By the time my run was concluding, the digital age had a pretty firm grip on our heels. The customary business cycle, which was a bad economic time, followed by a recovery, was replaced by an unavoidable steady decline. In that period of long transition, the major battles described in Battling Editor occurred, some more tactical, others more fundamental. There were always the battles to get the news and at the truth from people who had no interest whatsoever in telling it. There were the battles to print the news in the face of forces exerting pressures to keep us from doing it. In-house, there were the battles to stay within budgets and the fights to get more resources. There were the battles to expand the scope of our reach, which usually meant more money for staffers and newsprint. Most important were the battles to maintain our editorial integrity. Large or small, these battles were worth fighting to keep the newspaper at the level where it could perform most ably, always remembering to do its part to uphold the role entrusted to it by our Constitution. So crucial in our own day, the battleground is not only in Washington, but right here in our town, our county, our state. I thank you for your attention and look forward to your comments and questions.
When was it that the Times Union and the Knickerbocker News merged, and what was the party to do that?
Okay. They merged in 1988. That actually was late in the day for newspapers under of afternoon newspapers and co-ownership with a morning newspaper to merge. We were late doing that because the tendency had been, since the advent of television, but certainly even before then, when the economic structure of the country changed, when earlier people had factory jobs, they got up very early in the morning, they went off very early in the morning and returned in their home in mid-afternoon, picked up the afternoon newspaper and had a good time with it, used it in a utilitarian way. It informed and told them something that they could use. But as television began to dominate and radio began to flourish, people had that news already before they went off to work. And the kind of work that they were doing was changing. There were fewer and fewer of those jobs that took you out of bed at 4 or 5 in the morning, and more of the kind of jobs that took you to the office by 9, and into an office rather than into a plant. The whole country was changing that way. And when I would attend my annual editors' meeting, the one question I would always get was, when are you going to merge the two papers? Because that's what was happening all over the country. I resisted it almost from the day I came to Albany, when Roger Greer even presented a proposal to close down the Saturday Nick as a sort of trial run and incorporate some stuff of it into the Sunday TU. And we went by that without any difficulty. And the next publisher was fierce in its dedication to closing the Nick, and I always resisted. But I tell you, he had the winning argument, because over the years, as we looked at the circulation figures, the Times Union always made gains, the morning paper. And as good as it was, the Knickerbocker News, and it was good, always lost circulation. And it had nothing to do with its quality. It had everything to do with the lifestyle of the community. So, a few years on, we began seriously to plan And it took us several years of planning to make sure that we would do it right. When that fateful day came with my agreement, we did not lose one staff position. We integrated all people working at both papers into one staff, and it went fairly smoothly. And if my memory serves, most of the higher, as these executives began to develop, first the middle level and then higher executives at the Times Union, and an awful lot of them had their beginnings at the Knickerbocker News. So it was a good integration, and the integration meant that the Times Union, for the first time, had the firepower in terms of staff and the newspaper in terms of space to do the job that we wanted to do. And we had an enlarged state bureau, we had an enlarged business staff, an enlarged editorial page staff, we had science writers and education writers and transportation writers, all specialties that we couldn't afford when we were separate papers. And when we were separate papers, if there was an event at the Colonie Library that was worth covering, the Knickerbocker would send a reporter and the Times Union would send a reporter. But the Schenectady Gazette would only send one reporter. You know, the economic kind of scares you. So I think it was and it was during this period after we merged and after we dominated and we reached out to Columbia County and much more to Saratoga County. And when shortly thereafter, the Schenectady Gazette, which had been publishing 6 days a week, decided to publish a Sunday paper, which scared the management of the Times Union no end. We maintained our editorial quality, and we stopped them in their tracks. We maintained and increased our circulation, even in Schenectady, even when they went Sunday. So we got a lot of benefit out of combining. I was wrong to have fought it for so long. I should have agreed earlier.
Have the qualities needed to be a good editor changed over the years?
I'm sure they've changed in more recent years in that editors today are confronted by dealing with the internet, both in a positive and in a defensive way. In a positive way, how do you make use of the internet? And in a defensive way, how do you fight it off? So that's a complication that I didn't have to live with. And that's a complication reporters have to live with every day that they didn't have to live with in the past. And a reporter's job is a very, very hard job. If it's done the way it's supposed to be done, it is extremely hard. And so now compounded by this element of you're not only writing for the paper, you're writing for the webpage. The webpage doesn't have a press run starting. It's always it's always starting. It's constantly in motion. But as to the intrinsic skills, I would say no. I think you need to be, you need to bring to, from my own experience, which I can speak of looking back and not so much looking forward, I would say you need to tell people what you want from them. First of all, you need to establish your standards, and then what you want from them, and then you have to see what you can do to help them get it. You don't want to stand in their way. You want to give them running room, but you do want standards to be observed. It's tough.
What do you see as the major challenges facing America's free press, and are you optimistic or pessimistic when you look to the future?
Well, the major challenge is stares us in the face every day. As I tried to point out, a vital segment of our political life and safety is a free press. The reason it's the First Amendment is that the press is there to keep an eye on the government. You don't need a First Amendment to publish whatever the government says. the government would be delighted if you published verbatim reports of what they said. They would cherish you. They would reward you in whatever ways they could. But the freedom exists in order to be a critical observer, to watch it when they're not obeying the rules, and to expose it. And this was understood if you read the literature, the background papers from the very first in the discussions going up to the Constitutional Convention, in the Federalist Papers and elsewhere. This was part of the intellectual fiber of colonial America. And it's been part of our life, at least in terms of tradition, if not always in execution. The press has not always been, frankly, as good as it is today, and isn't as good as today as it should be. What is my prediction for the future? I wish you wouldn't ask me that, because it isn't good. I see the pathway to one, but I don't see that that path will be taken. Our system was designed to keep us from this situation. And a large part of the Electoral College was intended to be that these people chosen for the Electoral College by the states would be distinguished in their own communities of such upstanding character that everyone universally, of whatever party persuasion, political persuasion, would recognize them as solid citizens. And so if a demagogue or a rogue or a fool or a knave were elected, I just described our president, haven't I? They would overturn the votes cast, and they would elect somebody else. But that system hasn't worked ever the way it was supposed to work. And to get rid of the Electoral College now, which would be necessary to reinvigorate majority rule in this country, will not happen constitutionally, because the small states that benefit from the Electoral College would never agree to surrender it. I wish I could say, somebody said to me the other day at dinner that in 10 years we'll look back at this. It was the worst of times, but we lived through it, and now we're all happy together. We've all moved back to the center, and I just don't know what that chap was drinking. I was drinking tea.
Could you shed some light on the beginnings of the Watergate story? And also, would you care to comment on Albany politics, under the O'Connell regime?
So we're going to be here for how many days? At the beginnings, you want me to speak about the beginnings of Watergate?
When it first dawned on you and Ben Bradley that it was something...
Well, you have to ask Ben Bradley. You're going to have a tough time reaching him. He's dead. I was, first of all, Watergate became a Metro story by accident. It really should have been a national desk story. The people who cover the government in Washington. The Metro section, of which I was in charge, covers the city hall, the city services, the school system, the zoo, God help us, and things like that. And so when we got a burglary, we covered it because we covered the cops, and it wasn't Democratic National. Well, that's pretty good. For us, that's a magnificent story. For the National, that's what they deal with presidents and prime ministers, and so we had the story, and we kept the story, and we were getting, our boys were digging and they're getting and they're getting and we're getting. And 2 weeks into it, I'm having lunch with the police chief, Jerry Wilson. We, from time to time, did this because he had a very responsible job in the District of Columbia, and I had a very responsible job. So we were on good terms. And we sat and we talked, and that was the time, that was the day that John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, resigned his position as chairman or the head of the commission to re-elect the president, which was Nixon's re-election campaign committee. And he said he did this in order to spend time with his wife. And his wife was a troubled woman who had a problem with alcohol and would call newspapers at all times of night and make accusations and make wild charges. And he never lifted a finger in all the years that he did it. And from what I knew of Mitchell, he wouldn't resign because of his wife. And Jerry Wilson had exactly the same. So I told that to Woodward when I got back to the office, and he sort of nodded, and he didn't disagree. And as it comes to me, that's the first time. I knew it was an important story. How important, I did not know until then. Then I knew it was a very important story. Did I know it would reach the White House and Nixon? No. I did not know that.
I think we all tend to subscribe to newspapers or periodicals that support our own opinions and bias. And sometimes that disturbs me because I would like to see more objectivity in these periodicals and newspapers. How does the newspaper try to bring forth that objectivity?
You have to go to the newspaper, and objectivity, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. I value objectivity. It is a fundamental part of my work as a journalist. And I have challenged the new journalism, and it's been a lonely battle because the new journalism has largely been successful in personalizing journalism. And in the course of that, introducing elements that I think skewer journalism. When I was editor, I made every attempt to control that. But it's up to the institution to do that. But I would also say, and I've heard this comment, that I've been out now on this book for several weeks. I hear this comment time and again, and different people have different ideas of what is objectivity. And I really couldn't address your question unless you laid the article in front of me or the paper and said, this is what I mean, and then I could have a reaction to it. But absent that, I think the major newspapers try to do the honorable thing with greater or lesser success. I mean, but they don't try to, there are some that try to be unobjective because they have a political slant, both on the good side and on the bad side.
A couple of years ago, I saw the movie Spotlight about the Boston papers uncovering the pre-sex abuse scandal. I'm interested in your take about that type of reporting and whether that's something that's going to continue to grow or shrink as there are financial issues with newspapers, because I thought that was incredible. The movie was not based on a book, it was based on what the reporters did.
I agree. I think what their work was outstanding, and pace setting. And curiously enough, Ben Bradley's son was a major player in that story at the Boston Globe. And that's the best kind of work. That's why you go into newspapering, as far as I'm concerned. You don't go in to provide the bowling scores and what the kids do in high school and the high, you have to do those things to keep everybody sort of happy, right? But you're really there to do the kinds of things that the Boston Globe did in that investigation. That was extraordinary, and he's now the editor of the Washington Post, by the way. I'm sorry? Oh, all the time. Take a look in Washington. Take a look at what the Times is doing, what the Post is doing, what the LA Times, much diminished in staff, is still doing, what the best of the digital people are coming up with. Yes, it's still being done. Thank goodness.
Do you see that there will be an end at some point of the paper? In other words, something tangible that you can pick up and read?
Well, I don't know. I mean, papers today, in order to survive, have to integrate themselves into the internet. So they do both. They offer it in print and they offer it on the internet. It is much cheaper to do it on the internet. You don't have to pay for trucks. You don't have to pay for a building. You don't have to pay for printing presses. So a lot of money is made just by doing it compared to what you do have to pay for when you're a paper press. I think for the foreseeable future will be a combination of print and internet. The New York Times fairly recently made public that it had 4 million circulation. 3 million of that was on the internet. 1 million was in print. That's a very good report. That's a very good report because they don't get paid that much for the internet. Then again, it doesn't cost them anything. What will happen in the future? I think if in the future the internet is brought under control, that is to say, the Facebooks and the Instagrams and the Googles and the whatnot can no longer acquire private information and sell it, which is possible that it might happen because people are finally waking up to the dark side of that, see the Russian penetration of our electoral process. Then I could see a revival of the printed page. If it isn't, if all the advertising and the attention isn't sucked out by the internet. But that's a hazardous guess,
I subscribe to the internet publication, and recently, all of a sudden you see this Hearst publication. In other words, all of a sudden they're advertising that they're part of the Hearst publications. Can you explain to us about where Hearst is now? I mean, I think that family is long gone, but where are they and what's going to come of it? Thanks.
We have a Hearst in charge of the Times Union. George R. Hearst III. He's the grandson of the founder of the Hearst empire, and an empire it is. I assure you that the Hearst is now Hearst. That's what you're hearing because they no longer want to be called corporation. They just want to be known as Hearst. So that's what that's about. But they're there, and they're in a lot of other businesses besides newspapers and magazines and radio and TV stations. There's still a lot of businesses there, but they're in financial, they own Fitch, the financial reporting service, they own medical publications, They're the biggest provider of, they're one of the richest corporations in America. You don't know that because they're not a public company. They don't have public shares. They're not evaluated by a public stock market. But believe me, they're there. And I tell George you asked for him.
What role, if any, do you believe the media played in the rise of Donald Trump?
I think media had a lot to do with it. I think he was overcovered to a fault at the beginning because he was a celebrity, and he also knew from years of experience how to play the media. But he was treated as the emperor of Ethiopia. I mean, he got into his limousine. There were cameras there. He was a candidate who was supposed to lose, you know, and he was getting all this coverage. So I think we played a large role. And of course, he's also histrionic. So that feeds into our weakness, right? And so he got play, especially on cable TV. I think the pencil press was more restrained, but not totally. The New York Times, in a confessional article, they did a series of articles about, in-depth articles, about his wealth that they got through diligent work and how his father transferred wealth to the children illegally. And it was a presentation of about 20 pages. It was a stunning piece of work. To equal Spotlight, what Spotlight did. And one of the articles was the first-time story about Donald Trump when he was a man about town, a young man about town in Manhattan. And it glorified him. Successful, rich, a charmer of women, none of which was true. And they confessed to that. They were picking up his own description of himself and regurgitating it. Now, this was not the New York Post, and this was not the Daily Mirror, and it was not the Daily News, the tabloids. This was the New York Times, was writing about him as if he were a serious person. In a time that he was a real estate developer, and he was getting away with his fraudulent activities.
As a follow-up to your description before of being an editor, you said that being a reporter is an extremely difficult job. What does it take to be a good reporter?
I think it takes, first of all, curiosity. I think it takes energy. It takes a certain amount of brains. It takes some writing skills. Oh, Joanne, you're giggling. We never found someone like that. But you get that in different amounts and quantities. You understand that. But curiosity and energy, and I think integrity.
Let me ask a question.
The book's called Battling Editor. What was your biggest battle in Albany?
To maintain the quality of the newspaper and its editorial standards when our economic base was being undermined by the economy. That was the hardest job.
Harder than dealing with politicians?
Oh, much. Well, yeah, because with the politicians, it isn't that hard. I mean, it's tough sometimes. But you can do it as long as you have the support. But the real battle was to maintain. There are 18 different ways to put out a newspaper and call it a newspaper. But there's only one good way to put out a newspaper. And so people come and say, well, why don't we put it out way 15, right? We're still a good newspaper. But no, you're not you're not as good as you can be. That's the battle.
All right, well, thanks. Or any other question? One more, and then you're just some books.
I'm curious about the second part of this.
Oh, Carlo? Oh, Carlo was very unfriendly to me. He died before I came to town. I thought that was rude of him. But I did have a long-term relationship with Corning. It was at best, it was correct, at least, I would say correct. He did not like the articles we were doing about him. But what he complained about directly the most were things involving heating degree days that we would publish every day as part of that. And he was following them, and other items about moisture levels for which we assigned a clerk, to compound this thing. And we always got it wrong, and he knew we got it wrong, and it would call me to object that we got it wrong. That annoyed him, and what annoyed him was he was Erastus Corning II, Roman, Arabic numeral second, 2 ND. Our style book, which is a sort of a quasi-Bible that tells us all, this is what we do every day, so we don't do it one day this way, and then another day this way, and the third day the third way. So the Bible said that when we had a numeral after the surname, it would be the Roman numeral. So we would print Erastus Corning, Roman numeral 2. Wow, that sent him. Yeah. So I thought he had a reasonable point. So I would go to my copy editors and I said, look, the man wants to be known as the second. Do me a favor and let him have it. Don't, the second. So for about a week or two, they would have the second, and then boom, it was the Roman numerals. When Stan Ludine was the lieutenant governor, he wanted to be known as Stan Ludine. But our style book said we didn't use abbreviated names. So it was Stanley Ludine. So I had the same go around with that. But he was, we had obvious differences. We covered him very thoroughly, did several series exposing the work of his administration. We supported him when we supported him. When the Springboks, the South African rugby team, came to play in Bleecker Stadium, there were groups from South Africa, there were groups that wanted them not to play because they came from apartheid South Africa. And Corning took the position that they were entitled to play because under the First Amendment, they were entitled to play, and we supported them in that. Even though it stirred, not that we were in favor of apartheid, we were editorially and repertorially against it, but on the principle of that free speech, we supported it. I don't remember any reforms that he made that we supported. When he was ill, I went to see him a couple of times in the hospital at his invitation. And the last time I saw him, he was very frail. He was tied up with many tubes. He was wearing one of those silly hospital gowns. Very frail. Had a tube in his throat. And the last thing he ever, and we spoke, he said, well, when he gets better, we're going to do this and this and that together, right? We're going to make Albany a better place to live. Yes, and the last words he said were, we'll have fun together. Then he went off to Boston, to the specialized hospital there, and soon thereafter he passed away. So when he died, he had been mayor for 41, 42, 43 years, longer than anyone else in history anywhere. we were ready. We were prepared. We had all the stories. All we needed, frankly, was the date and time, and we were ready to go. And we upped the number of pages, and we did it, and we printed it. And people were outraged that we would give this man whom we had criticized and investigated and written about such a send-off. But we felt that he was a truly historic figure, and he deserved that kind of treatment. And we weren't going to dance on his grave because of that.
What was it like to oversee coverage of the New York State budget process, and was that different than your oversight in other areas of the paper?
Well, the budget is always difficult, because it's so complex. And we get the budget, and then we assign several reporters to study it and to break it down, and then we try to break it down into chunks that are digestible for the readers and for us. But it is a very tough thing. I must be a very tough thing to put together. It's also a tough thing to understand and to deconstruct and to explain. I wouldn't want to have to do it every week, let me put it that way.
Thanks for coming.
I thank you very much.